Aquaba, welcome to You Ain't Imagining This. I'm your sister host and today's storyteller, Amma Robin. I hope you're finding small moments of peace today and places where you can breathe. The porch is where I often find small moments of peace, and you're welcome to join me here for one of our porch talks. And yes, I mean that. You can find some porch moments and talks in the show notes, so feel free to browse and to come sit on the porch. As I said, I'm so glad you're here with me today. YAIT Town is a safe space for you if you've ever felt exhausted, hypervigilant, dismissed, overlooked, or somehow made to feel smaller while navigating predominantly white spaces. I can say to that, check, 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 and check. I definitely have. And if you've ever felt that way, come and sit a while here. You ain't alone, and you ain't imagining this. You see, YAIT Town is a space where we talk honestly about the subtle and sometimes not so subtle realities of living Black in white-centered spaces, where we're often asked to doubt our own experiences. That happens a lot. YAIT Town is a space where we can name what happened. It's a space where we can trust what we feel, and it's a space where we can remember that our stories matter. Before we begin today, I'd like to ask you for a small favor. If you know someone who's exhausted from navigating predominantly white spaces, someone who's carrying the weight of being questioned, overlooked, dismissed, or simply tired of having to explain what they know to be true, please share this episode with them, because all of us deserve spaces where we feel welcomed and safe. And if this space has ever done that for you, I hope you'll help someone else to find their way here too. So come on, get comfortable. The porch light is on. Let me tell you a story. I'm going to call this the luggage story, but later on I think you'll agree this story wasn't about luggage. Anyway, I begin. I was recently taking a flight from Marrakesh to Valencia. Just a few weeks ago. It was a short flight, about 2 hours. I was sitting in row 3 of the airplane, looking out of the window as we began our descent. The seatbelt sign had already come on. People had put away their laptops and folded their tray tables. A few passengers were putting away their luggage or just shuffling around or staring absently out the window. For instance, I was staring absently out the window for the moment. The energy on the plane had shifted. We were no longer traveling. We were finally arriving. It had been a comfortable flight, but I was looking forward to landing. I had settled in for the last 15 or 20 minutes of the flight. My carry-on bag was in the overhead compartment directly above my seat, exactly where I had placed it before takeoff. Everything was absolutely ordinary. And then things changed. I noticed a flight attendant standing in the aisle beside me. At first, I didn't pay much attention. They are always moving through the cabin, checking seatbelts and collecting stray cups and helping passengers prepare for landing. But then I saw her open the overhead compartment above my seat and remove my bag. I had a computer bag. For a moment, I simply just watched. I thought, well, maybe she's checking something in the compartment, or maybe she needed to move something around in the compartment. But instead of putting it back, she put it down and began carrying it to the back of the plane. That really got my attention. I sat up straighter. "Excuse me," I said, and she turned. "Why are you moving my bag?" And she answered immediately, as though the reason were perfectly obvious. "Oh," she said, nodding towards a man standing several rows away. "This gentleman needs this space for his bag." I looked in the direction she indicated. A white man was standing there in the aisle, too. His row didn't seem to be near mine. His seat wasn't near mine. But apparently, he needed the overhead space where my bag had been placed. I looked back at the flight attendant, then at the man, and then back at her, for an explanation. She looked me in the eye and then continued with what she was doing. Neither of them appeared to think that this was strange or unusual. The solution had already been decided. That man needed that space for his bag. He needed the space where my bag had been throughout the flight. So my bag would have to move in order to make space for his bag. The flight attendant continued down the aisle carrying my suitcase, and I watched her. She went past row 4, 5, 6. She went all the way to the middle of the plane, towards, I thought, around row 15. I watched my bag disappear from sight. And for a moment, I just sat there. The seatbelt signs were on. The engines were humming, so I could tell we were going to be landing. Everything on the plane continued as though nothing unusual had happened. But something inside me became very alert. Not angry, not yet, but definitely alert. I could say vigilant, and perhaps that's a better word. Because I wasn't thinking primarily about the luggage. I was thinking about the decision that had been made. Why would my bag have to move? Why was I the one being inconvenienced? Why was I the person expected to absorb the disruption? There were lots of passengers on the plane. It was practically full. There were dozens of bags, too. Yet somehow, the easiest solution, according to her, had involved taking my bag from above my seat and moving it 12 rows to the back of the plane. How was I supposed to get my bag? I did ask her that. How am I going to get my bag? And she said, "Oh, I'll help you with that." Well, jumping ahead just for a moment, she didn't help me later on. She didn't help me at all. I kept looking towards the back of the cabin where she had placed my bag. And the question just kept turning quietly in my mind. Why was his convenience more important than mine? Why did everything unfold as though it were just self-evident? Why was his bag more important than mine? Or to be honest, why was he more important than me? And when I think about the details, the flight attendant hadn't asked me or notified me. She hadn't asked me, she hadn't said, "Would you mind if I move your bag?" She hadn't apologized for the convenience. She hadn't even notified me that my bag was moved. She had simply acted as though, of course, this is how the situation should be resolved. Of course, I would be the one to adjust. Of course, his need for convenience outweighed mine. In fact, if I had not been watching, I wouldn't have known where to find my bag after the flight landed. She hadn't even paid me that much consideration, but she had gone out of her way for him. The plane landed a short while later. Passengers stood up and reached for their belongings. I remained seated. My bag was 12 rows behind me. When my robe was finally allowed to get up and exit, I had to work my way back through the cabin to retrieve it. Fortunately, some of the other passengers helped too. This was difficult and it was inconvenient, and she hadn't helped me retrieve my bag. By the way, the white man had already taken his bag and left the plane. I found myself thinking about this incident long after I left the airport. I'm still thinking about it now, because the thing that stayed with me wasn't the inconvenience. It was the familiarity, the feeling that I had experienced some version of this before. Not just on airplanes, everywhere. The feeling of being the person expected to move and make space for someone else, a white person. I was the person expected to absorb the inconvenience. I was the person whose comfort could quietly be traded away to make someone else's experience, a white person's experience, easier. In the past, I might have questioned myself about this. In the past, I might have thought that maybe it wasn't a big deal. Maybe I was reading too much into it. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe I should just let it go. But not today. Not anymore. Because over the years, I've learned to pay attention to those moments that stay with me. The moments that seem small on the surface, but settle somewhere deeper. Those moments that my mind wants to dismiss, but my body refuses to forget. And as I sat there for the rest of the flight, I realized that what stayed with me wasn't about the luggage. It was the feeling of being the person expected to move, the person expected to adjust, the person whose inconvenience seemed easier to accept than someone else's. Of course, the white person's inconvenience. And once I recognized that feeling, something became clear. I knew why the moment had stayed with me. I knew why it felt familiar, and I knew that I wasn't imagining this. And that's my luggage story. But as it often happens here at YAIT Town, the story isn't just about luggage. So, let's go beyond the story. Asante Sana, thank you for going beyond the story with me today. One of the things I've learned is that stories are more than just stories. They are experiences. Stories help us name what happened, restore what was depleted, and remind us that we are not alone. And I know you know that what makes this story stay with me isn't the luggage. If it were really just about my computer case, I would probably have forgotten about this by the next day. I may have been annoyed a little bit, but I would have moved on. And I would have gotten my computer bag, gone on with my trip, and never thought about it again. But that's not what happened. There was more. What stayed with me was the feeling that something happened that I instantly recognized, even though I couldn't fully explain it at the time. Have you ever had one of those moments? A moment where your body notices something, particularly something wrong, something bad, before your mind fully catches up to it? Perhaps your stomach tightens and your attention sharpens. Something inside of you says, wait a minute, what's going on here? But you don't have the words for it yet. That's what happened to me on that plane, and I think that's why the story stayed with me. Not because my bag was moved, but because I immediately recognized the social dynamic underneath it. The white man needed the space. My bag would have to move. Simple, efficient, obvious. At least it seemed obvious to everyone involved. Nobody asked me whether I minded. Nobody asked for my input. Nobody apologized for the inconvenience. Nobody seemed to think there was anything unusual about the solution. And that's what caught my attention. Not the luggage. It was the assumption. The assumption that I would be the one to adjust. The assumption that my inconvenience was acceptable. And that someone else's, the white man's, convenience should be prioritized. And, if you're black, like I am, you've probably experienced some version of that before too. Maybe not on an airplane, but maybe at work, maybe in a classroom or in a store, maybe in a doctor's office. It doesn't matter. There can be different settings and different people, but it's the same experience and the same or similar feeling. The feeling of being the person expected to move, to adjust, to accommodate, to be inconvenienced. And what makes these moments especially exhausting is that they're usually not very dramatic. Most of the time, no one says anything openly racist. No one announces what's happening. No one explains the hierarchy out loud. Instead, it just lives in the subtle decisions, in the small displacements, in the quiet prioritizations. Those tiny moments that, taken one at a time, seem easy to dismiss. But that's how exhaustion begins. Because now you're left trying to figure out what happened, what really happened. You replay the interaction again and again and again. And not because you're looking around for racism, under every rock or around it every corner. And not because, we're trying to be offended, but because your mind is trying to make sense of something that your body already noticed. And you start asking those questions about overreacting or reading too much into it, or would this have happened to anyone else? Would this have happened if I were white? Should I have said more? Should I have pushed back harder? Should I have just let it go? And that replaying can be exhausting. But many of us do it because we live in a world that's constantly encouraging us to doubt our own perceptions, to minimize them or explain them away, or to give someone else the benefit of the doubt, to tell ourselves that we're imagining things. But we're not. Sometimes we're recognizing patterns, and that's what happened to me on the plane. But I wasn't responding only to that one moment. I was responding to a lifetime of moments like this, a lifetime of being in spaces where someone else's comfort was centered and mine was negotiable, a lifetime of always being expected to move. And you all know I'm a big reader, and I love reading, and I was recently reading James Baldwin, and I had an aha moment. I guess that's not a surprise. James Baldwin is so quotable and so deep, and it's not surprised to have an aha moment reading his work. But he wrote an essay in 1980 called Dark Days, in which he said that to be black in America was to confront and be forced to alter oneself. Ooh, that's right. Confront and be forced to alter oneself. And I can't stop thinking about that quote while also thinking of the incident from the airplane. Because in many ways, that's exactly what this moment was about. Being forced to alter. Being forced to alter. That's why I think James Baldwin is so powerful. When he wrote about black people being forced to alter themselves according to patterns forged in history, he was describing exactly this incident. Generations of people being required, sometimes politely, sometimes violently, sometimes softly, but sometimes explicitly, being required to move, to adjust, to accommodate, and to make room for white people. That's why the luggage story just doesn't feel like a luggage story to me. And what strikes me most is that he wrote those words in 1980. Of course, that was the beginning of the Reagan era, too. Terrible, terrible time. But he wrote those words 46 years ago. And many of us still recognize that feeling. The settings may have changed. Some of the laws may have changed, or their enforcement. Some of the language has changed. But the expectation, or the demand, or the requirement, I'm not sure which word to use, to move remains. That's still there. And this also brought up another story. True, it reminded me of an experience or incident with the civil rights attorney Sherilyn Ifield. Several years ago, she was working at a table on an Amtrak train when she was asked to give up her seat so that a white family could sit there. She refused. The seats weren't reserved. She was already there and working and spread out working, and she saw no reason that she should be required to move. When I first heard that story, what stayed with me wasn't about the train seat. It was the question underneath it. Why was she even being asked? Why was she the person expected to move? And I think that's why this airplane story also carries more emotional weight than someone who's never had these experiences might understand. I do realize some people may be saying, gosh, it was just a bag, forget it. No, it was more than that. The incident itself was small. The bag was moved. Nobody used a racial slur. Nobody made an overtly racist statement. Nobody announced, in words, the hierarchy. But history teaches us that the question is often not simply what happened. The question is really, who was expected to move? For generations, black people have been legally required to move to the back of the bus, to move out of the waiting room, to move out of the neighborhood, to move out of the city, to move out of the school, to move out of the lunch counter, to move out of that seat, to move out of the voting booth, to move out of the library. Remember that story of Ronald McNair as a child who was told to leave the segregated library in South Carolina? Yep, that library today bears his name, but the situation could have turned dangerous like it did for so many other black people. We've been told to move over, make room, accommodate, adjust, alter yourself. That's why I think about Rosa Parks when I think of stories like this. No, not because an overhead bin is the same as a segregated bus. It isn't. The stakes are entirely different. But the question underneath felt strangely similar. Whose comfort is being centered? Who has to move? Whose inconvenience is acceptable? Who is expected to accommodate? But we know that history does not end with buses. Entire black communities were forced to move, sometimes through the law, sometimes through intimidation, and sometimes, and not a few times, but a lot, through racial terror. Communities like Greenwood in Tulsa were destroyed because other people wanted the land. And I'm talking about white people wanted the land, the wealth, the opportunity, and the power those communities represented. Families fled Rosewood. They had to. Think about also dozens of lesser known but just as vibrant black communities destroyed through violence and intimidation, eminent domain, the words are fancy, same thing, urban renewal projects, again, fancy word, but still move, highway construction, and sometimes out and out land theft. The message was often, we want this land, you move. Black neighborhoods were carved apart by highways. Others were pushed out through redlining and gentrification and displacement. Sundowning towns were everywhere throughout the South. Leave before sunset or you will die. Again and again, the message was the same. Move. This space is not for you. We want this space. Even today, many of us still hear those echoes of that message. And sometimes it comes in the form of, if you don't like it here, you can leave. Or get out of this country. I recently received that one. I guess actually many times. But what is that if not another version of the same demand? Move. Your concerns are not welcome. Your thoughts are not welcome. Your presence is conditional. If you can't accept things as they are, then you should be the one who moves. And maybe that's why moments like the one on the airplane and on Amtrak with Sherilyn Ifill and others, they stay with me. And not because they're identical to these larger histories, but they echo them. Because they touch something many black people know in our bones. I've started thinking about this as being treated like the movable person. The person whose comfort is negotiable, whose plans can be interrupted, whose inconvenience is acceptable. The person who's expected to adapt while everyone else remains exactly as they are. A person who matters less. A person whose presence is conditional. A person whose rights can be overlooked for the convenience of someone else. I'm just going to say it, white people. And that really is what connected the Amtrak story, my airplane story, Baldwin's observation about being forced to alter, Rosa Parks, move out of that seat, Greenwood, redlining, you can't live here, and other displacements through terror and force, and so many other moments in Black history. Those are all connected. They may be at different levels, but they're all the same experience. Not the seat, not the luggage, not the table. Those are not the story. It's the expectation that we will be the ones to move. So, yeah, I found myself feeling the weight of history on the plane when she was moving my bag away and saying that this gentleman needs that space. And not because it's the same thing as segregation, because it isn't. The stakes are different, and no, I'm not Rosa Parks. But I couldn't help thinking about how often Black people have been told to move. And the message, was never just about the physical space. It was always about who mattered. Who mattered. And yes, while the laws have changed, many of us still encounter those same echoes of that hierarchy of who matters today. And those moments can stay with you. I know it's staying with me because they're rarely about just one incident. It's about a pattern, a history, a long and remembered history. I think it may even be in my DNA, but I know it's something my parents have talked about, I've read about, and I feel it and recognize it, and my body remembers. It's a quiet understanding that I've been here before. Maybe you've had those same moments too. Those moments that stay with you because they weren't really about the one incident, but about something larger that incident revealed, and you felt it. If you did, really drop me a line. I'd really love to talk with you about that or to hear your experience. So, there have been moments where maybe you wondered or found yourself replaying an incident or an interaction long after everyone else had forgotten about it, or moments where you wondered whether you were overreacting, or moments where you questioned your own perception. If you have, I want to leave you with this. This was never really a story about a bag being moved. It was a story about who was expected to move. And if you've ever found yourself wondering whether you're imagining it, no, you ain't imagining it, and you definitely ain't alone. Asante Sana, thank you for joining me today in YAIT Town. Another Asante Sana for listening to the story and for taking a few extra moments to go beyond the story with me. This is our community, and we need to know that we belong, that we are safe, that our experiences are witnessed, and that we matter. If you know someone who needs this conversation, someone who could use a reminder that they're not imagining what they've experienced, please share it with them. The porch light will be on for you and for them. So come as you are, take what you need, and you ain't imagining this. Ashe, fam.